I'm Fonzo.
And I'm Eliza.
And we're the co-host of Grown, a podcast from the Moth that shows we're never fully grown.
Growing up feels like a phase that should end at some point, but does it ever really? Whether you're 16 or 26 or 86, you're gonna have to deal with family drama, your body, and the type of person you want to be. So why not put it all out in the open and go through it together?
Join us every other week to deal with cringe, culture, and the courageous efforts of people like you to get grown.
Start listening today. Follow Grown on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.
I never felt particularly religious as a kid, but I did grow up with a lot of religious education. On Wednesday evenings, I went to classes at the Catholic Church, and for most of my childhood, spent Sundays attending 8:30 a.m. Mass and then shuttling over to a family friend's house for 10 a.m. Hindu Sunday school called Balvihar. Despite all of this religious exposure, what I remember most in terms of conversations around sex and sexuality is silence. From the silence, I inferred that sex was something I shouldn't be thinking about, at least not until marriage. I'm a 90s kid, which means that I didn't have to look far to see and hear things that reinforced these teachings. For those of us who grew up alongside purity culture or thoroughly immersed in it, how does that legacy show up in our lives and bodies today? This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. The folks I knew growing up who wore purity rings and had purity ceremonies were Jessica Simpson and Britney Spears, which is to say that I was not in the thick of evangelical purity culture. Before we meet some people who were, a heads up that this episode contains mentions of sex acts, erotica, sexual violence, and sexual trauma. If you need to stop listening to this episode or pause it for later, feel free to do that now. Okay, here we go.
An image that encapsulates purity culture for me is one I heard recounted in a sermon, a testimony supposedly from a male college student who said that the existence of women on his college campus posed such a challenge to him in his battle with lust and sexual temptation that the only solution was to treat any woman he encountered as essentially a floating head and to make every effort never to look below her shoulder. We're sexualized to such a degree that boys and men have to metaphorically dismember us in order to interact with us even semi-normally.
I had to take a class in high school called Courtship, Marriage, and Family, where the course readings were heavily focused on Joshua Harris books, author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye. We had female teachers, a PE teacher, who would remind us of the importance of keeping our bodies fit for our husbands. I have flashbacks of the scrupulous choir director in my high school that would stand in the hallway and write females up for dress code violations.
I remember one of my youth pastors standing on stage holding a flower, and as he described physical acts like holding hands, kissing, hand stuff, oral sex, and finally penetrative sex, he plucked petals from the flower and said that with every physical act, there would be less of us left to give to our future spouse.
You just heard from listeners Tope, Jessica, and Anna. Those images have stayed with them for decades. The same is true for writer Liz Lenz. The metaphor seared into her brain: clean tissue, dirty tissue. Liz is a writer who explores the intersections of faith, politics, and the body, and those interests stem from her own experience.
I grew up in this subculture of homeschooled evangelicals, and I was born in the early 80s. I'm number 2 of 8 kids, and our whole world was home and church and home and church. And everything we heard was about staying pure, not just from sex, but our minds staying clean from the evil influences of the world. This was also a backlash, to second generation feminists who had worked to legalize, or at least get Roe v. Wade through the Supreme Court. There were so many antiquated, misogynistic laws just being systematically taken off the books in states throughout the country. The impact of second generation feminism was all these women put into these pretty high places, and there is a cultural scramble to pull them back down again.
Liz saw the politics of gender playing out in real time. She remembers pastors making comments about Hillary Clinton's appearance and got specific guidance about how she should be thinking about her own.
I'm one of 5 girls. I'm the second oldest. And there was just this vigilance over our purities and our bodies. And so when I turned 16, my dad gave me this ring that was, Black Hills gold. It was, God bless, I love my parents, but it was cheap and ugly. And I hated it even then, because we didn't have a lot of money. And so, to me, I was like, ooh, jewelry. Like, I'm a 16-year-old girl. I was so excited. And then I get it. I'm like, I hate this. But I felt like I had to pretend to like it. At least at the time, I was just like such a type A rule follower. I just wanted to be a good kid. And everybody was saying, like, this is how you be a good kid. It just felt confusing and weird.
So there was a lot of focus on the body, purity culture kind of teaching you your body is your greatest gift. It's important that you preserve its purity, don't attract any attention to it. And you mentioned that, as a young kid, you had some questions, you had some pushback, but you were also very much in this world. At what point did you start questioning the tenets of purity culture?
I was questioning my faith in high school. Not my faith exactly, but I was questioning what all these rules were there for. I was homeschooled until high school, and the moment I got to high school, I was a weird kid who sewed my own clothes and wore, newsy style caps to high school, public high school. I did that. I was a weird kid. And, but of course, who were the kids that befriended me? All the weirdos, the kids who were the kids of color in my small South Dakota high school. It was the queer kids at my small South Dakota high school. And so, I find myself in this space where the people who are my friends and I love, I'm going to church and being taught that they're sinners or bad. And I think right away that just didn't make sense to me.
When Liz went off to college, she stayed committed to abstinence and didn't date. But she did put away her purity ring after it got into an altercation with her loofah in the shower. She read lots of books and kept asking questions. And then something happened that became a real and terrifying secret.
In college, I was sexually assaulted. I had gone to a conference where I was presenting a paper. It was this huge honor. I was very excited. And I went and hung out with some of the other students at the time. We were drinking. I rarely ever drank, but, I was just there and I did it and I drank. And then I was assaulted. And at the time, I remember thinking, 1, that it was my fault, 2, that I had done it, and 3, that everything was ruined. I didn't have a lot of clear memories of it. I remember waking up in the morning and I was in a strange city and I had like no money on my bank account. And I remember immediately thinking, I have to get to a Planned Parenthood because I cannot be pregnant. I went and I remember coming back and washing my face and then presenting my paper and then just staying in my room the rest of the time. And I think what was happening was I was trying to figure out how to keep control of my life. And at the time, that just turned into pretending like it hadn't happened. I just pretended like it didn't happen. And the cognitive dissonance, I think, is truly powerful. I really understand when women, talk and say, wow, I didn't understand what had happened to me was assault, because I just didn't have the language for it. I mean, I was 21, but sex had been taught to me in such black and white terms. It was either you stay pure or you're ruined, and that's it. So I don't know. I'm a survivor, so I was just like, okay, how do we move forward?
Liz finished college and got married when she was 22. For the 12 years she and her husband were together, she never told him about her assault. With some distance from their marriage and divorce, she's seen just how much both purity culture and her assault affected the way she approached sex in her marriage.
When you teach a woman that, the only thing she has to give to her future husband is her body, and that's the only gift, and if you wreck it, it's wrecked. Maybe you can pray enough and God will redeem you, but it becomes an obligation rather than a joy. And so then I get married, and then we're not attracted to each other. Sex is an obligation. It's difficult. And I become a mother, and I'm realizing that I don't even understand my body. And I think it was becoming a mother of a daughter and a son, very specifically, that made me feel like I was so disconnected from my body and my sense of joy and pleasure.
Purity culture teaches women to control their bodies and men to control their minds, so that both don't fall down the slippery slope toward sex. But then when sex is on the table after you exchange vows, how do you erase all of those decades of programming telling you to fear and avoid what's about to happen? Liz encountered that conundrum on her honeymoon, and so did Nathanael Novero.
Because I was so principled about not having sex before marriage, my fiance found that very attractive.
Nathan is a documentary filmmaker and former youth minister. He grew up in the Bible Belt in Arkansas as the child of Filipino immigrants. Purity culture led him to believe that if he was a good Christian and waited to have sex until marriage, God would bless him with a fulfilling sex life.
Once the honeymoon came, I already made a decision years ago that I was not going to have sex on my honeymoon night because it'll just be too exhausting. And that honeymoon night was the most amazing, blissful, peaceful sleep that I remember having, just to share that space with my bride. Both of us just skin against skin. What a delight. Pure heaven. The next day was when our nightmare began. We simply could not perform. My wife locked herself into the bathroom for 3 hours. I did not know how to handle that situation. And that was the moment when I was thinking, is this normal? And it continued. It continued for 15 years. So we really didn't feel peace until we just simply let sex off the table.
Nathan knew he would be waiting for sex until marriage from a young age. Like Liz, he and his two brothers grew up inundated with purity culture messaging.
In Asian cultures, there's such a grip on family respect and family honor, not shaming your parents and how you live. All of that translated so effortlessly into the purity culture world of Christianity in the Bible Belt.
Nathan even ended up preaching that purity culture messaging while working as a youth pastor at summer church camps. But it didn't always sit right. And eventually, he left the camps and the ministry altogether. As he started exploring the effect purity culture had on his life, some realizations clicked into place.
What's happening is there's a duplicity. Christianity didn't teach us spirit embodied. We are taught that we have to accept Christ to return to his grace, and that the body is essentially sin. So this separation from the body at the very get-go, what does this do to us in our psyche? It essentially teaches us to lie at the very beginning, not trust whatever information is coming from our bodies.
For Liz, those realizations happened as she started working on her book, Godland.
I remember sitting in a seminar in Chicago, and my marriage was falling apart by then. I was really struggling. I was trying to be a woman with a career, and I was being pushed back, into a motherhood only role that I didn't want. And I remember hearing a woman say that it's white supremacy and patriarchy that tries to separate us from our body. And that really spoke to me. And I really began to understand what that purity culture narrative had done to me. It had separated me from being a fully embodied human being. As I tried to explore that and try to experience that, my marriage fell apart because my marriage was based on this rigid definition of my body and my sexuality. I could only ever be the one thing.
Nathan and Liz both felt disconnected from their bodies. But how do you get from noticing to healing? Liz has processed a lot of that in her writing. For Nathan, the answer was making his own erotic films. Yeah, you heard that right. I know it may seem like a big leap, but it's exactly what he needed.
Something I discovered out of purity culture was that I was afraid of women and sex. How did I study this? Well, let's just kind of move ourselves around and see what happens. I checked out some adult exotic places where women dance and you can pay them, and so I went over there and I discovered that I was shaking and trembling uncontrollably. And I then noticed that I, who was an eloquent speaker, as a public speaker, could not speak in those spaces. My mind would go blank. Something is blocking me off from talking about pleasure. So all of these clues made me feel like something, perhaps in an indoctrination level, locked me out. So what happens if I step in, take a breath, and just see what happens? So when I shot the film, one of the reasons why I shot it with the camera is because when I'm behind the camera as a man, I feel like an ostrich who sticks his head in the ground. I feel like I'm gone and I'm invisible. No one can see me. Of course, people can see me, but I just feel like I'm safe. I feel like I'm safe when I'm behind the camera. And whatever's in front of the camera has my full attention and my full worship. After I made that film, I basically felt that I experienced God. I just felt this tremendous grace. I have no idea what to say. And I've led people to Christ. I've seen that happen. So what I felt was equivocal. And now I had to start a whole new search, toss the script, and rediscover God in myself again.
Redefining faith after experiencing purity culture wasn't a linear journey for Liz or Nathan, nor for many of y'all.
My partner actually helped me start deconstructing purity culture with a simple, but to me, radical thing he said in high school. I was apologizing for what I perceived to be a defect in my body. And he was like, Anna, I love your body because it's yours, right? Not because it looks a certain way. And that was honestly the moment when I began to stop seeing myself as an object and started kind of realizing that I could be a participant in this experience of both love and pleasure.
I hit my purity culture breaking point when I was in my 20s. I was out as gay and trying really hard to remain an evangelical. I was doing everything right, and still people just assumed that I was having sex. And I realized that purity culture was really about respectability, and that no matter how respectable I was, I would never be accepted just because I was queer. And that's when the whole edifice fell down.
In terms of moving away from purity culture, I would say rather than a single breaking point, there have been multiple moments of rupture for me that have been part of a process of divesting myself of the assumptions and effects of purity culture. Some of those moments have been more profound, some less so.
When I started to deconstruct purity culture, the thing that changed the most for me was that I think I actually had a deeper, more profound spiritual relationship because it was no longer wrapped up in fear, shame, or rules.
You just heard from Anna, Shannon, Tope, and Kelsey. Divesting from purity culture's messages about sex and the body has particularly high stakes for parents who don't want to pass the same lessons on to their kids.
As I was dismantling purity culture within me, I felt at the same time this urgency to ensure that my kids have a better way of living.
That's Cindy Wang Brandt. She's an ex-evangelical who has dedicated her career to helping parents raise their children unfundamentalist. She's written a book called Parenting Forward and hosts a podcast by the same name. Cindy was born and raised in Taiwan, where she attended an evangelical missionary school that taught purity culture messaging. She followed its rules, got married, and has 2 kids.
I felt like I wasn't damaged by purity culture because I did everything right. I didn't have to feel ashamed about anything. I didn't feel like a crumpled rose or a chewed up gum or anything like that. And so it wasn't until the recent years, that I would say the past couple of years, that I, after I deconstructed a lot of other things about my evangelical faith, that I realized, I wasn't unharmed by purity culture. I was harmed. It just got to a point where my partner and I both had suppressed our sexuality, or at least parts of our sexuality, for so long that it just was inevitable that it was going to come to the surface. And that's kind of what happened. And we didn't have practice communicating very openly and honestly about our sex, our sexual desires, our sexual preferences, and we didn't really prioritize our sex life as partners, and we were suppressing, because of all of that, we were really suppressing a lot of who we were to each other.
And you situated us in this being a relatively recent shift for you. You have 2 kids, and they were already teenagers at the time that you began to really dismantle your own purity culture ideology. So tell me about kind of that intersection of recognizing your role as a parent of teenagers and the messages that you wanted them to have about sex and sexuality, and where you were at that time in your own journey with this.
It does feel a little bit like I was urgently trying to input a sex positive message to my kids. I really wanted to make sure that my kids had a better way of thinking about themselves, that they could love themselves, that they would not see their misbehavior as sin, but as simply a misalignment of values or a lack of regulation in their bodies. If I would unlearn something about purity culture, I would just be frantic or desperate to make sure that my kids kind of learned the opposite, so that they didn't have to unlearn that.
Unlearning something and relearning something new at the same time, it makes your brain hurt. But Cindy has some good advice.
I work with a lot of parents, and I always try to encourage parents to take a breath, to take a beat, right? To understand that, hey, your child is not you. Your child is growing up in a different time, and indeed they are. They have different resources, the kinds of messaging that they're learning. Even though I believe the culture is still largely sex negative, there are really good resources out there now and information that I didn't have access to.
You've said that being able to unravel and distinguish the difference between privacy and shame was something that was really important in your own sex-positive parenting journey. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And maybe you can give us an example of how you could impart that distinction to a kid.
Yeah, I think because of the sexual silence from purity culture, we just felt like if there was anything that we couldn't say, that we couldn't share with other people, for example, your sexual desire, if you feel turned on by a movie scene and you're like, I could never tell anybody this. And the reason I can never tell anybody this is because it's sinful and it's shameful. As I dismantled that and embraced sex positivity, I realized, no, it's actually really normal. It's a very normal human impulse to be sexually turned on. But just because something is not shameful doesn't mean it needs to be something that is shared with whoever and wherever. Sometimes I feel like people who emerge from purity culture tend to overshare because they feel like, well, if I don't need to feel ashamed about this, then I can just say everything. And, there's social norms that you still need to abide by. And also, right, as parents talking to kids, you don't need to be sharing every detail about your sexual fantasy with your kids in order to be sex positive.
Unpacking shame is huge. Y'all have heard me have some conversations with my own parents on this show, and I think all three of us still have some work to do in acknowledging the shame clouds that hang over our sex talks. Cindy gets a lot of questions from parents about how to not pass down this shame to their kids.
I hear from a lot of parents that they struggle when they're with the way that their daughters dress because they grew up being ashamed of their body or being told that their bodies were an object of lust. And so their impulse is to repeat the way they were treated and to tell their daughters to cover it up. But then at the same time, they don't want that for their daughters. They want their daughters to embrace body positivity and to express themselves with freedom. And so that's where your values and your triggers become in conflict with each other because you're triggered from your own purity culture. It's important to have compassion for yourself when you are parenting out of fear. That it's understandable. You love your kids. You want to protect them. And so fear is natural. And just like we want to validate emotions in our kids, we should validate it in ourselves. But I think we shouldn't let fear make the decision. And to say, okay, I respect my fear. I know that it comes from love, but I'm going to choose a different way. I'm going to not say anything maybe. I'm going to let my daughter dress the way that she would like. And this is where it's so important for parents to have support communities because they can kind of vent your triggers to other adults and other supportive parents. Then you can come to your kid with a better decision with a more regulated body, and you can really collaborate with your kid on how to move forward.
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast and WUNC's other shows on demand, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. Incredible storytelling like you hear on Embodied is only possible because of listeners like you. This episode was produced by Kaya Finley and Audrey Smith. Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer, and Quilla wrote our theme music. The show is supported by Weaver Street Market, a worker and consumer-owned cooperative selling organic and local food at 4 Triangle locations in North Carolina. Now featuring online shopping with next-day pickup. weaverstreetmarket.coop. And if you enjoyed this show, please share about it on social media, send it to a friend, or tag us in a post. It helps new folks find our show, and it means so much. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.